From Washington, D.C. to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, I'm Kevin Cirilli.
And from New York, I'm Taylor Riggs. Welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. And Kevin, it is all business today because the stock markets are still approaching those record highs. The print that we are looking for on a closing basis, 33.86. For that, we're going to go on over to Abigail Doolittle. Abigail, we're just a few points yet away, but I've been saying this for a few days now.
Yeah, it seems like we are stalling near these record highs. That often happens. It's considered to be an important level of resistance where the sellers stepped in, and back in February, that was a very big moment where they stepped in. So the buyers having a bit of a hard time overtaking that level, especially right now. We have the S&P 500 up slightly, the Dow down slightly. This as the rotation into the reopening sectors or the cyclical sectors stalls a little bit, where we have more strength, not surprisingly, tech, this year's defense with both the tech index, the NASDAQ index, and the New York FANG index, which has lots of those momentum names, including Tesla, among others, climbing sharply higher. In the month of August, though, it's interesting. The cyclicals are actually leading the way on the year, though. As you know, Kevin and Taylor, it is all about tech. So it's going to be interesting to see how the month of August plays out. But right now, a little bit of a sleepy summer day.
Abigail, it's interesting, though. It doesn't look like it'll be sleepy for much longer. We know that August historically is a pretty volatile month. We're in an election year. What is future volatility telling us about the 20-day realized vol?
Well, you know, it is interesting because there's lots of reasons to think that we could have volatility spike, including the fact that we are in this seasonally higher volatility time, August, September, October. Another thing is the VIX curve points to a big spike in October, back above 30. The SKU index, or the quote-unquote panic index, is at levels close to where it was prior to the sell-off in February and the sell-off in fall of 2018. And the fundamental backdrop, of course, for this, Taylor, is despite the fact that we had the better initial jobless claims today, which is excellent, we're moving in the right direction, below 1 million, but it's still extraordinarily high. It doesn't even put the financial crisis, you can't even see the numbers around the financial crisis relative to where we are right now. So it really comes down to stimulus. You know, the Fed is doing their job. They've put in tons of liquidity into the system, but we need a deal out of D.C. To not just help, the economy, and it right now seems to be propping the stock market, the hope that it's going to come through, but Americans, and of course our team down in Washington, as you both know, are saying that it could be in September, maybe even October. That could really create a world of hurt. Let's hope not, but there are reasons to think that we could have some volatility ahead.
All right, thank you, Abigail. Let's continue to talk about that potential volatility ahead coming from Washington, D.C., because Wall Street may still be counting on an eventual stimulus deal, but in Washington, things are looking more like a stalemate. The White House and congressional Democrats are still $1 trillion apart on the next relief package, as the number of Americans applying for unemployment benefits fell below 1 million for the first time since the pandemic began in March. For more insight, I want to bring in Oren. He is the executive director of American Compass. Oren is also the author of The Once and Future Worker and formerly served as a domestic policy advisor to Mitt Romney. Oren, thanks for joining us. You know, Abigail just laid it out for us. Even to see and to celebrate just fewer than 1 million people filing for unemployment is an unfortunate, remarkable sign of the times. But that's gotta put pressure on lawmakers in Washington to get to a deal. But I don't think it's going to.
It certainly doesn't seem to be. I mean, the levels are still so high. And the other important thing is, as this has gone on so long, we've really lost the thread of this idea we were going to have just a temporary blip that would recover quickly. I mean, people who have lost their jobs now, 6 months ago even, are I think rightly realizing that there might not be a job to go back to. And so I think some sort of action is incredibly necessary. And obviously the parties are nowhere near agreeing on anything.
Oren, are you thinking that some of the improvement in the data that we're seeing in the American economy is taking the pressure and some of that urgency off of Congress to really come up with a compromise?
That seems to be the case on the right of center, where I think Republicans, at least a segment of them, and this includes the White House, have tried to take the position that the recovery is underway and almost sort of a mission accomplished moment. Which frankly doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, the data is not as bad as in the moment of lockdown, but it's still terrible economic data, and we're less than 3 months from an election now. So it's hard to understand that view, and I think it's also hard to understand the Democrats' red line of saying that we need to be paying this additional $600 a week of unemployment essentially indefinitely when that's frankly more than most people would be earning in the job market.
On the issue of Speaker Pelosi, yesterday she and Secretary Mnuchin trading some intense political jabs at each other as it relates to criticism that they each side has of each other for lack of getting a deal. But for Speaker Pelosi, I mean, you look at the $1 trillion spread, $1 trillion, and that's a hefty chunk of change, even here in Washington, D.C., and it's coming off of the $2 trillion that was happening in the last round of stimulus. What are the potential areas of compromise that you see behind the scenes when you dig into the policy weeds that you see that Speaker Pelosi could say, all right, Secretary Mnuchin, here's where I'm willing to give a little bit in order to get to a deal?
Well, my I guess uninformed outsider view would be there should be plenty of room for compromise on this unemployment insurance amount. You know, it's not like everybody thought $600 a week was a sensible idea even when it initially passed. That was something that Republicans were always opposed to, and something I think a lot of neutral observers would have paused and said, well, wait a minute, how did we get to that high an amount when that's, you know, now paying unemployment above what most jobs pay? And so I think there's a lot of room to still be really committing to substantial support for people who are outside of the job market right now, and recognizing that some of that's necessitated by our public health situation, without sticking to a number that is hard to square with the country's economic reality.
When I speak with sources at the White House as well as sources on the president's reelection campaign, they say that the president is fully prepared to take additional steps with executive orders in order to, if Capitol Hill can't get to a deal. Do you think that the executive orders that the president passed are going to be effective, or will they lead to more business and regulatory uncertainty? And what other executive orders could the president take if Washington lawmakers can't get to a deal?
Well, I don't think executive orders make sense here. Partly just as a legal matter, I don't think it's appropriate for the White House to be trying to do these things unilaterally, and that's certainly something that Republicans understood when Obama was taking these kinds of actions. And to their credit, some Republicans have stood up and said it wasn't right then, and it's not right now. You know, the end game here has to be some sort of compromise in Congress, and I think we're seeing then just practically. There's tremendous uncertainty about what the Trump administration has even done, what it means, how on earth states would implement it, and especially when you get to what's probably the worst idea in here, which is what they're calling this deferral of payroll taxes. No one has any idea what that means or how it's going to work. I'm an employer here at American Compass. Am I not supposed to withhold payroll taxes now, or I withhold them now, but maybe have to give them back, or I give them back now, but might have to collect them again later? It's no way to run an economy or a government, and it's certainly not the right path toward providing some stability in the face of the incredible challenges we have right now.
Oren, on that note, where is the role of corporate responsibility at this moment? I'm just thinking anecdotally of the law AB 5 in California, which then recently ruled that Uber and Lyft, for example, need to convert employees to being freelancers into being full-time workers, and really putting the burden on the employer. Where do you see the role of corporate responsibility versus government at this moment?
Well, I think at this moment there's a tremendous amount that only government can do. I mean, when you're talking about the sides being trillions of dollars or $1 trillion apart on a deal, that gives you a sense of the scale of resources we're talking about in the face of a pandemic. But I think more broadly, and Uber's a great example, we're finally having an important discussion in this country about what we want to expect from corporations generally. I mean, for a very long time, the view has been, well, the job of the corporation is to make a lot of money, and as long as they're trying to do that, that's going to generate great benefits for everybody else as well. And the reality is that that's not necessarily how it works. That if we want competition and free markets to generate great outcomes for workers and families and communities, we're going to have to put some constraints on corporations and make them behave responsibly, because they're not going to just do it out of the goodness of their heart.
Capitalism with a conscience. It sounds like that's what you're talking about. Let me follow up on this. Is now the time to be worrying about deficits or no?
I don't think this moment is the time to be worrying about deficits, but I do think as we do what needs to be done at this moment, we accept and acknowledge that this is only going to heighten the need to figure something out down the road, and that this shouldn't be seen as kind of setting a precedent that we can be even more careless next year.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Our thanks to Oren Cass. He is the executive director of American Compass. And coming up, how are conservatives planning to run against the Biden-Harris ticket? We'll speak with the former chief of staff to Senator Mike Lee next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm Kevin Cirilli in Washington.
And I'm Taylor Riggs in New York. And Kevin, we now want to go on over to Mark Crumpton to get an update on the Bloomberg First Word News.
Taylor, Kevin, thank you. Israel and the United Arab Emirates have agreed to establish full diplomatic ties. It's part of a deal to halt the annexation of occupied land sought by the Palestinians for their future state. President Trump announced the deal from the Oval Office earlier.
This is a truly historic moment. Not since the Israel-Jordan peace treaty was signed more than 25 years ago has so much progress been made towards peace in the Middle East.
This makes the UAE the first Gulf Arab state and only the third Arab nation to have active diplomatic ties with Israel. The FBI is stepping in to help investigate last week's massive explosion in Beirut. The Lebanese government resigned after the blast that killed more than 170 people, injured at least 6,000, and caused widespread damage. It's still unclear what caused the fire, responsible for igniting nearly 3,000 tons of ammonium nitrate that was stored for years in Beirut's port. But documents have emerged that show the country's leaders knew about that stockpile. On Capitol Hill, there's still very little sign of compromise on the next round of pandemic relief. The two sides are at least $1 trillion apart on another relief package to help the economy recover. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi says she won't resume talks unless the White House budges on its call for $1 trillion cap on the measure. President Trump continues to push for a payroll tax cut. The Philippines will join the final phase of clinical trials for Russia's coronavirus vaccine. President Rodrigo Duterte is willing to be inoculated after the vaccine's likely approval from his country's regulators. U.S. health officials are skeptical of Russia's claims to have a coronavirus vaccine. It was registered before Phase 3 trials. Those trials normally last for months and involve thousands of people. In other vaccine news, Johnson & Johnson will be supplying the European Union with 200 million doses of its treatment. That story broke in just the last few minutes. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. Taylor, Kevin.
Thank you, Mark. And let's come back to D.C. Because one of our top stories this week is presumptive Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden finally has his running mate, Senator Kamala Harris, a Democrat from California. For how this affects President Trump's strategy in November, let's bring in Boyd Matheson. He is the former chief of staff to Senator Mike Lee, a Republican from Utah, and the opinion editor for the Deseret News. All right, Boyd, thanks for joining us. You know, I want to talk to the policy because I've read so much analysis in the last 24 hours. Is Senator Harris a progressive? Is she a moderate? Or do we not know?
Yeah, I think the jury is still out on a lot of that. I think there are people who are saying, well, she is kind of a policy person. Some people are even debating, you know, is she a politician or an activist in an activist moment? So I think the jury's still out there. She does like the policy components. I think there is some substance there, to be sure. But in terms of how that actually is going to impact the ticket and impact what happens on the first Tuesday of November, I don't really see that being a needle mover.
What are, though, some of the policies, I'm thinking criminal justice reform for one, that she brings to the table that the Republicans now do need to respond to?
Yeah, I think you're right. A lot of the work on the Judiciary Committee, she actually worked with Senator Lee on some things around some of the per country caps on skilled workers. So that will be an interesting to see how she navigates that now as the vice presidential running mate with Joe Biden. And I think that's going to be her challenge, Taylor, is looking at some of the things she's done, in particular when she was Attorney General in the state of California, where she really kind of was a little bit of a picker and chooser in terms of what she enforced. Some of the laws that were put into place, some of the referendums that were passed by the voters of California, she chose to ignore. And I think a lot of those things are going to come back and require a lot more attention.
Well, you know this, Boyd, on the issue of policy, especially energy policy, one of the issues that the Trump administration wants to draw a contrast for in battleground states is fracking. And already when I talk to sources on the president's reelection campaign, they are quick to point out that Senator Harris is a supporter of the Green New Deal framework initiative. How do you think that support will play in battleground states? In Scranton, Pennsylvania, Joe Biden's hometown.
Yeah, in particular in places like Pennsylvania, a lot of those areas are going to be really challenging. And I think there's actually an even bigger issue in terms of who is actually going to go after this new group. We're calling them the movable middle. These are folks who are center left to center right. They're not independents. They're either Democrats or Republicans, but they've sort of disconnected because they're tired and exhausted by all of this. And here's the really interesting thing, Kevin. The only way to re-engage this group is by talking about community, compassion, personal responsibility, and opportunity. And Kamala Harris is not talking about those things. I think if she ends up being just the attack dog for Joe Biden, which the vice presidential role often is, I think that is a losing strategy for the Democrats. Everyone knows what they're against. If they make this just a battle against, I watched this morning on every network, the subhead was always making the case against re-election. The American people, they know what you're against. They want to know what you are for, and particularly that movable middle who will decide this election, especially in places like Pennsylvania. They want to know what you're for, and are you for community? Are you for personal responsibility, compassion, and upward mobility opportunity? That's the real test.
And Taylor, I think to that specific point on policy, especially as it relates to foreign policy, there are so many questions, Taylor, surrounding Senator Harris's foreign policy record. Now, we know that she is a supporter of the Iran nuclear disarmament deal, something that Democrats are in favor of, obviously a contrast to Republicans. But on a day, Taylor, when so much news coming out of the Middle East, how she would handle the Middle East, how she would handle China, and she has backed legislation that would allow and make it easier for the U.S. to go after Chinese officials who steal intellectual property from America.
Kevin, let's pose that foreign policy perspective to Boyd. And it's interesting, Boyd, on a day like today where President Trump is helping to at least broker a deal between Israel and the UAE to help normalize relations. This is an area where perhaps the president has been a little bit more weak. Critics would argue that maybe Joe Biden has some big foreign policy experience. Boyd, how do you see the foreign policy being an issue in this election, coming into play? How did these two candidates stack up?
I think it's a fascinating thing, and it was really the big debate, I think, coming down the home stretch in the decision-making process for Joe Biden was, did he want a vice president like Susan Rice, who had more of that national security, international skill set? Obviously, Senator Harris does not have that. And again, on a day like today, where you're looking at it, you know, most administrations go in thinking they're going to focus solely on domestic policy, and it's just not the way the world turns, and it's just not the place that America can go hide and just worry internally. And so it does matter. Foreign experience does matter, and it's something that she doesn't bring a lot to the table on. And in a very unstable world, I think that's going to be a question.
So as you look at the broader now sprint to Election Day, I mean, we've talked about this before, you and I, just about the dynamics of how the pandemic have placed constraints on their ability to campaign. And you look at the odd reversal of fortune now for a Democrat winning the 2020 election. It's just completely skyrocketed now from during the pandemic. But But this inability for President Trump, for Vice President Pence, for Biden and Harris, Senator Harris, to get out there on the campaign trail as we head up to the virtual conventions, it's quite unprecedented campaign trail territory.
Yeah, no question about that, and I actually think that's playing to Joe Biden's advantage. And this is an interesting one to me, Kevin, that it seems that the Democrats already feel like that margin is good, that they're in a good place, and they're sort of in this, hey, let's just see if we can run out the clock. But we know from sports that we're missing tremendously during the pandemic. When you play not to lose, you very rarely win. And I think that's a big threat and a big risk. And I think everybody in the media has to start calling for Joe Biden to be sitting down for real interviews, not just standing in front of a teleprompter, not just doing stuff from, the basement. He has to engage. And if the only one who engages is Senator Harris, I actually think that will not play well, and I think it could hurt them coming into the fall.
All right, we're gonna have to leave it there. Fascinating dynamics. When you play to win, you often, well, we'll find out what happens. Thanks to Boyd Matheson, former chief of staff to Senator Mike Lee. And a programming note: Bloomberg TV and radio will have continuing coverage of all of the conventions. That starts next week. This is Bloomberg.
Time now for Stock of the Hour. Cisco heading to its worst day in 9 years after saying its pandemic weakness is likely not over yet. Scarlett Fu has more. Scarlett, what are you seeing?
Yeah, Taylor, today's decline wipes out the last 3 months' gains and also follows a pretty familiar pattern, which is a post-earnings decline for Cisco. So the outlook was what disappointed investors. It really confirmed that Cisco is not like the other tech companies in that it is exposed to the economic slowdown in a way that its bigger peers aren't. Sales this quarter may fall as much as 11%. EPS will also fall short because small and medium-sized companies are not spending on IT equipment and services. Demand in the Americas has not improved in the last 90 days either. And it's not just weakness at home. You have sales in Asia and Europe also down by at least 6% as well. What's interesting to me is that big tech gets all this attention because they're seen as both growth and defensive, but Cisco really presents as more of a cyclical defense company, tech company, I should say. A large chunk of its revenue comes from government agencies, small and medium-sized enterprises, and providers of internet video services. It trades at 15 times earnings compared with 36 times for the NASDAQ 100.
Yeah, wonderful analysis. Thank you always to Scarlett Fu. Stay with us. Coming up, we're going to go on over to the IPO market with Citadel Securities. This is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm Taylor Riggs here in New York.
And I'm Kevin Cirilli in Washington, D.C. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
President Trump says he opposes additional funding for the U.S. Postal Service. The president acknowledges that his position would starve the agency of money Democrats say they need to process and anticipate.
It looks like we're having some difficulties, Taylor, with our friend Mark Crumpton's microphone, but it really looks to be another fascinating day in Washington as people still trying to gauge whether or not there's going to be economic stimulus and whether or not ultimately the developments in the Middle East are going to play out in the foreign policy space on the presidential campaign trail.
Well, and Kevin, you and I are going to be all over the convention coverage starting next week. You have the Democratic convention. The week following that, you have the Republican convention. From your sources that you're speaking to, I mean, the Democrats have a lot of momentum coming with them with the VP pick. What are some of the main key takeaways that you're really looking forward to if we push the story to next week?
Well, Monday night is going to be fascinating to watch former First Lady Michelle Obama, then a Republican, former Ohio Governor John Kasich, and then Senator Bernie Sanders, who represents really the top individual who on the Democratic Socialists, to all be giving speeches. But what I find fascinating is the pomp and circumstances that you and I are so used and accustomed to covering, as our friend Tom Keene always says, you know, the body language in terms of all of the personalities on stage with the confetti and the balloons. all of that's gone. It's a virtual convention. So whether or not that plays well to voters in their living rooms or on their cell phones, we just don't know. So that's my biggest question mark heading into this viral sprint campaign season.
Well, I need confetti and balloons here as we are 2 points away from record highs on the S&P. So we will keep you posted on that. Kevin, I want to switch topics to a little bit more of a serious moment here because the U.S. has now reported its highest number of deaths from the coronavirus in a single day. This is all since mid-May. And as President Trump continued to press for schools to reopen. For more now, we welcome Dr. Howard Koh. He is the professor at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health and a former HHS Assistant Secretary for Health under President Obama. Doctor, great to have you here. Talk us through some of the tension that's underway within the school systems right now. We know that kids, perhaps maybe are able to survive this virus more so than some of the elder members of our community, and yet still there are some concerns about safety. What do you see?
Well, Taylor, this is a very important conversation we're having right now as the fall is arriving, as schools consider reopening, as flu season is on the horizon. We need to maximize communication, coordination, and public health right now. And the decision to reopen schools depends primarily first and foremost on the background community transmission of virus. So if there are places around the country with cases and deaths going up and positivity of test results high, it's going to be very difficult to reopen schools. There are other places in the country where it's much more likely, places like New York, where the positivity is 1% and cases and deaths have been dropping for quite a while. But even there, the conversations have gotten very complex. So there are issues with the health and safety of children who are not immune. Nearly 100,000 of them were infected in this country in just the last 2 weeks of July. Their families, teachers, about a quarter of them have underlying health conditions that need to be acknowledged and respected. Staff, and then there are lots of policies to be considered, like testing recommendations in schools that have gotten almost no attention so far. As well as social distancing and ventilation and other policies like that. So you can see how complex it is, and we need to get resolution on this as each day approaches and schools are considering admitting school students back for the fall.
Dr. Koh, I think back to in March and April when Washington was signing into law trillions of dollars worth of aid, and small businesses, medium-sized businesses, they really struggled in terms of how to get access to those funds. Right now, there's hundreds of millions of dollars of untapped resources that local officials and local schools could have access to. If you are one of those communities or you're involved with your local school board, who should you be calling to get federal aid, federal assistance that might help better inform the decisions or provide resources for safety for students to get back in the classroom?
So, Kevin, that's a great question. And one very disturbing theme through the whole pandemic response has been that there's not been a national coordination, national strategy for a national crisis. We have 50 states going in 50 different directions. The chaos around the schools is just one example of that. So at this time, we really need each state and each community working with one another, coordinating with one another. Each school has got to make this decision by working closely with their local and state officials. No school is an island, and then tracking those trends in terms of community transmission and making decisions based on data and science is going to be critically important.
Doctor, there's also difficult conversation that we're undergoing in this country about rising inequality. And for many students in poor communities, going to school is the only way that they're getting a hot meal. And if both of their parents are out working, no one is helping to oversee them, do their homework, check in, help them, be a teacher at home. How then do we start to have a conversation about the widening gap that this pandemic and closing down schools is having on rich and poor, and really the poor communities that are now suffering even more?
Well, Taylor, that's a very important question. And if I can say, as a son of immigrants, I'm very sensitive to those issues. We've seen how COVID has exposed these inequities that are just unacceptable, the huge impact on communities of color. And then this is not just a health issue, but it's also a child care issue. It's a nutritional issue. It's about income security because too many people have been forced to go to work when they don't have the luxury to stay at home. And many of those people are from communities of color. So these are all the themes that are front and center right now. We need to address all these issues as a nation, focus in on high-risk communities, particularly communities of color, and then resolve that this can never happen again as we go forward, because other threats are coming and we have to be better prepared.
Well, I think, but so here we are in the short term, and every family in America right now is having to grapple with this. And for working class and small business employees and medium-sized business employees, from an educational childcare perspective, there's the political, there's the policy, and then there's the practical. And Doctor, my question is okay, if schools shut down, parents around this country are going to have to be forced to decide where, if they have a job and they want to keep their job, where they're going to have childcare. And so if you shut down a classroom or if the classroom isn't able to be safe, but then you have to go into like a prohibition type of childcare situation, that doesn't seem to me any more responsible. But these are the tough choices that families and parents right now across this country are having to make.
These are really difficult questions. I'm not sure there's any easy answer. I know that in communities, there are some families that are working together to share the responsibilities of childcare and online teaching and other key themes that are front and center right now. I think this is where the coordination and communication at the local level, at the state level is absolutely vital, so we can all help one another get through these tough times.
Doctor, talk to us a little bit more about what you understand about some of the teacher concerns. If it is socially distancing, have we thought about ways, and this might be a little bit out of your expertise, but I'm trying to think from a doctor's point of view, are there ways to recreate classrooms so that we still can be socially distant between teachers and children? Talk about those new ventilation systems that we have in airplanes now, for example. What are some of the ways that you're thinking this through so when we can reopen, it can be safe?
Well, the CDC has actually put out some important initial guidelines on exactly that theme, Taylor. So they recommend that desks be placed 6 feet apart, that students be facing all in the same direction to decrease chances of exposure from one another, that masks, by the way, should be universally required throughout all schools. There's some new guidance that came out this morning from the White House saying that masks were encouraged, and I don't understand that because we need maximum protection right now in this terrible time. And then teachers have to be careful about themselves because many of them are older and have underlying health conditions. So they need to be working together to coordinate these policies, implement the policies. And if they're not fully on board and enthused, it's going to be really hard to make all this proceed in the future. We've seen some teachers unions sue in some states, and that's a very difficult situation as well. So this is why getting all the voices together, working together, setting up the policies now, and then tracking those trends going forward is really important.
Yeah, our thank you is always there. Dr. Howard Koh of the Harvard Chan School of Public Health. And still ahead, stay with us. Tyler Goodspeed, White House Council of Economic Advisors acting chairman. He'll be joining us later at this hour on those jobless numbers and much more. This is Balance of Power, Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm Taylor Riggs in New York.
And I'm Kevin Cirilli in Washington, D.C. And Taylor, I've still got my eyes on what those jobless claims are going to mean for the stimulus talks in Washington, D.C. And I'm thrilled now to be joined by Tyler Goodspeed. He is the acting chairman of the White House Council of Economic Advisors. And let me ask you, Tyler, how do you think that these jobless claims are going to put pressure or not put pressure on Speaker Pelosi and Secretary Mnuchin to ultimately get to some type of stimulus deal?
Well, thank you very much for having me. Well, we were certainly very encouraged by the jobless report coming out today. With initial claims down over 200,000 from the prior week, and with continuing claims down over 600,000. And we're actually looking even more closely at the seasonally unadjusted claims, because we do think that those, in the context of the very high levels that we're looking at, we do think that those are probably going to be a more reliable indicator. And certainly with the continuing claims, the seasonally unadjusted numbers were down by more. still they remain very, very high. We have a long ways to go, and I think that is why we saw over the weekend President Trump take executive action to provide continued enhanced unemployment insurance to unemployed Americans to help bridge this gap.
Tyler, in lieu of that, though, there's a lot of conversations going on if these are temporary job losses or permanent job losses. And the longer this goes on, the more permanent these become. The latest report saying about 18% now likely to be permanent. How do you turn that around?
Right. So in a report that we just released today, we report that by our calculations, about 82%, 82 to 83% of the job losses since February were temporary. Of the remaining, that's actually spread over remaining 18%, that's actually spread over several different categories. Of those temporary job losses, we do think that those are going to be more likely to come back. We've seen huge flows from temporary layoff back into employment in May, June, and July. And I think this is precisely the reason that President Trump is keen on a phase 4, a comprehensive phase 4 agreement that will continue to support a labor market recovery.
Well, Tyler, the expectation from the market and Main Street is that there would be something like a $1.5 trillion price tag on whatever deal is ultimately met. Or can you give us any insight into what additional executive action might be taken from President Trump the longer that this impasse and the longer that this stalemate continues?
Well, you're right that in the absence of action on the Hill, President Trump took decisive action over the weekend to provide payroll tax relief, to provide relief to student loan borrowers, and to provide protection for Americans at risk of eviction, as well as for the continuation of enhanced unemployment insurance benefits. And I can just say, I don't want to get ahead of the president or the White House counsel on some of these executive actions, but I can say that we are leaving no stone unturned.
Tyler, many think that when it comes to the economics, and the market certainly agrees that they like Trump, but it's been the handling of the pandemic that when you take a look at the odds of who wins the election, it has reversed now into the Democrats' favor. What do you do in just 2 months or so to get a grip on handling the coronavirus and then, of course, some of the economics behind that?
Right, so I don't want to trespass on public health terrain since that's not my expertise. But I can say that when we look at the cross-country evidence that has been coming forward in the past few weeks, we've just had a bunch of Q2 results from a lot of European countries, and the U.S. engaged in a fiscal response on a much larger scale than a lot of other major advanced economies. In fact, if we look at the fiscal response as a percentage of GDP in the first half of the year, compared to most other major industrial countries, the U.S. Fiscal response was much greater. And I think reflective of that is that the contraction in the U.S. economy in the first half of the year was shallower than that we observed in other advanced economies. We just observed in the United Kingdom in the second quarter a 20% contraction quarter on quarter. So I think, given the magnitude of the shock that has hit us, the United States federal government, under the leadership of President Trump, responded with historic speed and at historic scale. And as I said, we're going to be leaving no stone unturned when it comes to exploring every mechanism we can utilize to continue to support that recovery.
So with that said, is now the time to be worrying about deficits or no?
Well, I think that if one is concerned about long-run fiscal sustainability, the number one thing we should be focused on is attenuating the output gap. Nothing blows a hole in the long-run fiscal picture like a persistent, large output gap, and that's why the president is very much focused on facilitating a rapid recovery in the U.S. labor market and the U.S. economy more broadly.
Our thank you as always, Tyler Goodspeed, acting chairman of the White House Council of Economic Advisors. And stay with us because coming up next, we're going to get very important perspective on the state of that IPO market, all amid this pandemic. We go on over to Citadel Securities. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm Taylor Riggs in New York.
And I'm Kevin Cirilli in Washington, D.C.
Kevin, SPACs have raised more than $22 billion so far this year, making up almost half of U.S. IPOs by value. For more on the state of play, Bloomberg Wall Street correspondent Sonali Basak is standing by with more. Sonali.
Thank you, Taylor. I'm standing by with Peter Giacchi. Pete Giacchi from Citadel Securities, a well-known face on the New York Stock Exchange. Citadel Securities today handled 3 IPOs alone, or 3 listings alone. We don't remember the last time that's really happened. It's certainly been a long time. Pete, are companies just trying to go public before the U.S. election here? What's going on with all these listings?
Well, first, thank you very much for having me on. I'm excited to be here with you today and to get a chance to talk about, what's going on in the IPO markets. It's an interesting time. We saw a little bit of a slowdown in the IPO markets when the pandemic first hit in early March. But even through that time, as an organization, we were selected for 12 out of the 14 IPOs that listed during that time. I think it's interesting that companies are coming to the market now. There is a lot of appetite for companies in the market right now. The IPO pipeline is robust. As you guys mentioned, the Spac pipeline is really robust. We've been selected on 85% of all the Spacs that have listed on the New York Stock Exchange. We've also been selected on 78% of all the stocks that have been listed on the New York Stock Exchange for IPOs. So a pretty exciting time for the markets.
Right, but to the point about the election, we do right now see volatility elevated. Is the worry here that it will be more elevated later in the year? Why is right now the time that people are choosing to list on the exchange?
Yeah, I think that there was obviously some pent-up inventory coming to the market when we had the shutdown. Obviously, with a traumatic time that's happening around the world at that time, the world really did stop in its tracks. So I think we're starting to see some of that backlog come to the market. That's why it's so robust right now. As we get into the election, whether it's a couple of weeks before the election or a couple of weeks after, depending on what the result is, we'll probably see a little bit of a slowdown. And then in the last part of the year in December, we'll see those last companies trying to go out before the end of the year.
Pete, I was standing right next to you a little over a year ago, I guess now, when you have been working on Slack's direct listing. We broke last night that Palantir is looking to do a direct listing. How do you do a direct listing in a market that's more volatile? Are there concerns about it?
It's an interesting question. So as you guys know, there's basically 3 fundamental ways for a company to go public: the historical IPO, a direct listing, and now what we've seen is the SPACs as an alternative way for companies to access capital in the markets. And the direct listing fits a certain group of stocks, of companies that are going to want to use that process to go through it. And if they're not looking to raise capital, depending on really what the company's profile is and what the company is trying to accomplish, they're looking at how that happens. I would say this: with overall volatility in the market, depending on if the stock obviously has a historic background, it's been something that's well known, there's obviously a significant liquidity event. And as you guys know, on the New York Stock Exchange, we take a very thoughtful approach into how we open these. So I don't think that the volatility is as impactful as you would think.
So another thing that's happening in full force is the Spac market. I know you worked on Redbird Capital. That's the Billy Beane Spac that's listing today. And then there's also, you worked on Bill Ackman's Spac too. Why are investors doing this? Why is this so much more attractive than an IPO for some people these days?
I think that the way to really look at it is how the IPO process and how companies have had the ability to come to the public markets is evolving over time. And it's something that's going to continue to evolve. And I think what you saw was obviously the historical IPOs. Then we had the evolution into the direct listings. And now I think the third part of the markets is the SPAC piece. And I think when you look at some of the management teams on these SPAC teams, it's extremely appealing to some people to have access to be invested with some of those management teams and the decisions they're going to make on the capital they raised.
Now, Pete, I noticed you're standing on the stock exchange floor. Citadel Securities, you guys did operate quite well remotely for some time here. What's the vibe on the floor right now? Are you having to do listings a lot differently than you normally do them?
So, obviously as an organization, we pride ourselves on not only the fact that we have human traders on the floor, but that we have really, a high level of technology that we implement every day to help make deep liquid markets for the investing public and for our companies. We had a couple of secondaries today as well with companies raising funds in the market. And it's really good to be back on the floor. It's good to see the people's faces on the floor. The exchange, as well as Citadel Securities, has taken a really thoughtful approach about the employees' health and the social distancing. So, you know, we are operating as we did prior to the shutdown, just with a little bit more of a limited staff and relying a lot more on technology.
Right. Pete, thank you so much for joining us. That was Pete Giacchi of Citadel Securities. Kevin, over to you.
Thank you to Bloomberg Sonali Basek. And of course, coming up, Balance of Power continues on Bloomberg Radio. In our second half hour, we will have more on the peace deal between Israel and the UAE. And this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio.